studies. And about our speaker, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. So Dr. Gleb is an internationally renowned thought leader in future proofing. He specializes in helping forward-looking leaders secure their organization's future by forecasting and addressing threats and maximizing opportunities. He serves as a CEO of the future-proofing consultancy Disaster Avoidance Experts, a best-selling author of several traditional published books. Dr. Gleb is most well known for his 2019 bestseller, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decision and Avoid Business's Disaster, published by Carrier Press. And his 2020 best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, published by New Harbinger. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. They include USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS News, Fortune, INC Magazine, CNBC, and many more. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavior scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. So if you have any question or comment, feel free to shoot us the email to ASQ at you can send us the email to ASQ for any questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to kick things off to by welcoming our speaker. So over to you, Dr. Gleb.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Really appreciate it. All right, if you can stop sharing your screen.
I did.
Great. Appreciate it. All right. So let's talk about how you as quality professionals can defeat unconscious bias. We'll be using neuroscience. So quality professionals don't often talk about neuroscience, but that's where I come in. I publish often for Quality Digest and speak to ASQ groups about neuroscience, about how we think. Quality professionals really focus on the process, making sure that things are good quality. But there are lots of things about how our brains work that quality professionals don't necessarily know about. I mean, that's not taught in the various degree programs, that certificates that you get. And there's a lot of stuff that you really need to know in order to really do the best job you can as quality professionals, because unconscious bias, what does that refer to? That refers to poor decision-making we make about people. We unconsciously make bad decisions around people. And those bad decisions really impair quality. And that's what you want to address. You want to make sure that bad decisions around people, sometimes bad decisions that you make, often bad decisions that other folks make, don't impair your work as quality professionals. And it ranges from all sorts of things. When, let's say, operations staff fight with quality professional staff, when you're trying to make sure that the product is good, there's often some unconscious bias going on where decision-making around people, around conflicts goes in the wrong direction, and lots of other things. So we'll be talking about using neuroscience. We'll be talking about emotional and social intelligence, and I'll talk about what those are. But those are tools, specific practices and behaviors. All this, by the way, is extensively research-based. I will send resources after the presentation to whoever wants the resources for informing you about all the research basis for this presentation. So don't have to worry about that. So without further ado, let's talk about how you make decisions and how other people make decisions, and how might those be somewhat biased unconsciously without you realizing it. So the first thing I want to talk about with decision-making has to do with confidence. Now, you might have heard that you should be confident, and indeed, being confident is important for making good decisions. If you're not confident, if you're vacillating, you're going back and forth, that can create a lot of problems for good quality decision making. So that might be very problematic. So you want to have confidence in the quality of your decision making. And that has to do with following a good process and all that. As quality professionals, you know about that. You might not know so much about how we make quality decisions around people. You are really great at making quality decisions around process, good decisions around process, less so about people. Just inherently, that's not what you have been educated about. But I want to talk about stepping back for a second from the professional world. Let's talk about decisions we make in our personal life. Let's say in driving. So in driving, you have to make decisions all the time. When, switching lanes, merging, getting onto the highway. There's a lot of key decisions you have to make all the time when you're driving, even without you consciously realizing you're making those decisions. And I want to ask you, do you consider yourself an above average driver? Are you above average at merging onto the freeway? Are you above average in switching lanes? Are you above average in being able to keep yourself safe as you drive? I want to ask you that. And you will see right now a poll in where you will be able to answer that question. So the poll will show up in your Zoom, and you'll be able to answer whether you consider yourself in the top half of all drivers or in the bottom half of all drivers. Are you personally in the top half of all drivers or in the bottom half of all drivers? Please go ahead and vote, whether you're in the top half or the bottom half. So again, the poll will be in the Zoom. Go ahead and click on the poll, top half, bottom half. I say about just over 2/3 of the people voted. So I'll give you 5 more seconds to make your voice heard. 5 more seconds. All right, so let's check out the results. Fascinating. We see that 87% of the people here are in the top half of all drivers, and only 13% here are in the bottom half of all drivers. Well, by average speaking, 50% of the people should be in the top half of all drivers, and half of the people, other 50%, should be in the bottom half of all drivers. So the fact that we see this disparity, 87 versus 13, tells us something about confidence, especially excessive confidence. We all, quality professionals included, tend to have too much confidence about ourselves. And it comes out in questions about driving. It comes out in questions about our professional success. So when you ask about how good are you as a professional, so are you in the top half of all quality professionals or in the bottom half of all quality professionals? See those surveys that they've been done on extensive, all sorts of professionals. Lawyers say that over 90% of lawyers call themselves in the top half of all lawyers. Over 90% of professors call themselves in the top half of all professors. So this is something that you'll see very prevalent. And of course, only 90 versus 10%. So only 50% can be actually the top half. This is a problem. It has to do with our confidence, and we tend to be overconfident about our decisions, both about our professional decisions and especially about our decisions around people. That's a problem, and that's something that we have to deal with and understand as we try to address this unconscious bias within ourselves. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. There's a cognitive bias, so getting into the neuroscience. A cognitive bias, a dangerous judgment error that our mind makes, called the overconfidence bias. That's what it's about. Our tendency to be way too confident in our decisions. We tend to make snap judgments. We tend to feel too confident in our decisions. And that's a big problem for us. When people say they're 100% confident, on average, they're only right 80% of the time. 80% of the time. No wonder casinos can make so much money. That's a bad problem for us to have. That's characteristic not only of quality professionals, but of all human beings. It's especially dangerous for people with more expertise and authority. The more expertise and authority you have, the more confident you tend to feel. There was a study done on doctors, and junior doctors who are just out of medical school and senior doctors, several decades, decades out of medical school, lots of know-how, lots of experience. And they were presented with a case study, asked to make a determination of what's going on with the patient and what they would recommend for the treatment. And they got the right answer at about the same rate, the junior doctors and the senior doctors. So about the same rate of getting the right response, but the senior doctors were way more confident in their answers. than obviously they should have been compared to the junior doctors. And why is that? Why did they get the same response? Well, senior doctors have a lot of know-how, just like quality professionals. You have a lot of know-how in the field if you've been there for quite a while. But people just getting their degree coming out of school, they have more fresh information, and that's what happened with the doctors. That's why they were able to make the diagnosis at an earlier, at about the same rate. And I see a lot of younger quality professionals being, for example, more technology savvy and having a lot of skills that older quality professionals don't necessarily have. So there's issues with people who have been quality professional, quality field for longer, undercounting the capacities of people who are fresher to the field. Now, the problem here is our tendency to go with our gut, with our following our intuitions, going with our heart. That's what a lot of gurus tell us. Go with your gut, follow your intuition, trust your heart, all of that sort of stuff. It feels very comfortable by definition. It feels intuitive to trust our gut. That's where it comes from. You'll see Tony Robbins tell you to be primal, be savage, go with what you feel. You'll see Malcolm Gladwell telling you to blink, make your decisions in the blink of an eye. And that's quite problematic because it often leads to disasters. Following our gut intuitions, what we feel about people, especially people, often leads to disastrous decisions because our gut, our intuition, our emotions, our heart, whatever you call it, is actually not evolved for the modern world. I mean, the modern world with the internet, right now we're connecting to across Zoom with the small screens. The modern world with the rise of the internet has really been around since the 1990s. We haven't evolved for it. No way. Our brains are actually evolved for the ancient savannah when we lived in small groups of hunters gatherers of 15 people to 150 people. That's what they're evolved for. And in that hunter gatherer society, it was very important for us to be tribal, to look for people who looked like us, who shared our values, who shared our intuitions, who shared our cultural backgrounds, who rooted for the same team. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die. And if we weren't sufficiently hostile to other people who we feel to be not part of our tribe, who don't share our values, who don't share our philosophy, our religion, our ethics, whatever you call it, then that tribe would take us over and we die. You notice we're the descendants of those people who didn't die. And that means that we are very much tribal still in our intuitions and emotions. So when we let our intuitions and emotions lead the way, we make many dangerous judgment errors. And that's what cognitive biases are. You might have heard of this term before. Cognitive biases. These are the specific ways that our mind goes wrong, just because of how our brain is wired, because of this evolutionary background, because of the structure of our brain, just various wiring. I can answer questions on that, the structure if you have questions on that put them in the chat. I'm not going to go into the neuroscience too deeply into the presentation, just talking about the consequences of the neuroscience for your role as quality professionals. Okay, so let's go on to talk about something that many of you, so we're talking here about the general framework, the structure, and you need to understand that framework, the structure, what's going on in order to make good decisions around other people and to address unconscious bias within yourself and within other people. All right. Now that we talked about that, this structure, this framework, this overconfidence, I want to answer a question that a number of you might have as I've started this presentation. Probably not when you first saw me. I look like a normal white mainstream North American. I'm in the US, by the way, based in Columbus, Ohio. And of course, you're in Vancouver, but North American male, right? It looks very normal, mainstream. But when I started talking, you probably noticed I have an accent. A lot of folks immediately want to ask, where am I from? Where are you from? That's a question I get asked very often, and I'm happy to answer. I'm from a small country in Eastern Europe called Moldova. So you see this tiny country southwest of Ukraine, east of Romania, landlocked country. It's so small that it needs an arrow pointed to it to actually show where it is. My parents left the country in 1991. I was born in 81. My parents were 10 when I left. When they left with me naturally, didn't get a say in the matter, but I'm very glad that they left. We settled in New York City. In 1996, I saw a World Values Survey that said that of all the countries surveyed, Moldova was the least happy country in the world. The least happy country in the world. I don't know why, but that made me especially glad when I left. So as I mentioned, I settled in New York City. And much like Vancouver, it's a melting pot. It's a metropolis, lots of different people, lots of different accents. And so my parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage. And I decided to keep my accent, to not drop my accent. Unlike many immigrants who came to Canada or who came to the United States, especially those who didn't come to melting pots like Vancouver or Montreal or so on, or Toronto. People who came more to the heartland, where I live right now, Columbus, Ohio. So it's kind of more of a heartland area, not a melting pot sort of central city. And I was fine and happy in New York City, but I eventually left, get my PhD at the UNC Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the history of behavioral science, which is my area of expertise, how we behave and why we behave the way we behave, how our brain causes us to behave in certain ways that might not be good for us. And as I was learning about this, I learned about something that made me realize that keeping my accent was kind of dumb, bad decision on my part because of something called accent discrimination. Accent discrimination. What's that about? Well, for North Americans, this applies to Canadians as well as Americans. There's a false perception of being less trustworthy if you don't have a mainstream accent, mainstream Canadian accent, mainstream American accent. If you don't have that mainstream accent, especially if your accent sounds foreign, then that causes you to be perceived as less trustworthy. It's a false perception, of course, but that's what it goes. You might be hearing me right now and without realizing it, having a little bit of unconscious bias toward me, toward my accent, a false perception of what I'm saying as being less trustworthy because it feels like I'm not from your tribe. I'm not from the place that you are. I don't share your same intuitions, values. And that is, again, that accent discrimination. There's only one foreign accent to which this doesn't apply. And that's the UK accent, the British accent. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. So this accent discrimination relates to a pair of cognitive biases, which it's important for you to understand: the halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. What are those about? Well, the halo effect and the horns effect have to do with how we interpret people. The horns effect is about somebody having little horns, like someone with an accent. If you dislike one characteristic of someone, whether their accent, their appearance, their ethnic background, their cultural background, their politics, their religion, all of that sort of stuff, you'll tend to have too negative view of their other characteristics. You'll tend to perceive them as less trustworthy, like the accent, as more negative in general, without necessarily realizing that that's something that's going on. And that, again, is a sign of tribalism, where in the savannah environment, it was important for our ancestors to be hostile to those from other tribes and to be friendly toward those from their own tribe. And that has to do with the halo effect. It's somebody having a little halo on their head. So if you like one characteristic of someone, if it's something that you share that is important to you, like again, similar accent, similar cultural background, went to the same university, cheer for the same team, politics, values, religion, appearance, whatever, then you'll tend to have too positive view of their other characteristics. It's especially dangerous for business relationships. Well, like I said, when I do consulting for how do you actually effectively support your work as a quality professional in an organization, how do you make sure that the quality function in an organization does its work well? What I often tend to see is serious horns effects between quality and operations, where, for example, operations just wants to get their work done, just wants to get their work produced, and quality is, they perceive quality as slowing them down. It's just cutting them down. The operations, it's tempting to cut corners, to just produce stuff faster because it's what they're rewarded for, generally speaking. Producing as much stuff as possible, that's the incentive for operations. Whereas for quality, then the incentive and your job is to make sure the product is good quality. And of course, for the organization, it's important the product is good quality, but that's not the role, that's not the purpose of operations. So you'll often tend to see horns effects between quality and operations, between those divisions, and halo effects within the department. So quality professionals tend to have halo effect toward other quality professionals and also other control functions. So control functions that are related, for example, project management professionals often tend to be allies with quality professionals. And of course, operations has halo effects toward other operations and related staff. So that's a big problem. And that's internally within a company. It also happens the same way externally. And for that, I want to show you a brief video. And so I'll be sharing my screen. You'll be able to see my screen in a second. All right, so the salient thing about this video is that it was taken when I was doing a presentation, a closing keynote on diversity, equity, inclusion, addressing unconscious bias related topics at a HR conference. There were over 100 people at the closing keynote of an HR conference specifically devoted to diversity inclusion. And the conference was happening here in Columbus, Ohio, and it was overwhelmingly attended by people from Central Ohio. Now, if you know anything about Columbus, Ohio, you'll know that it's the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes football team. Very famous for this football team, college football. It's the big rage in Columbus, Ohio. And our big rival is the University of Michigan Wolverines up north. So it's a big rivalry, one of the biggest rivalries of college football, if not the biggest rivalry in college football. And so this presentation, I was asking the HR professionals in the room whether they would hire somebody who's the University of Michigan fan. And remember, overwhelmingly, the HR professionals in the room are Buckeyes fans. So let's see what they say. So, as you know, I'm a professor at Ohio State. I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. I'm guessing there are a lot of Buckeyes fans here, you know. Go Bucks, right? Yo, there you go. Now, how likely are you to hire a Michigan fan? See, 3 people. Now,
3 people out of all.
Regardless of how we feel about Michigan fans and their poor choices in which team to root for, does that indicate anything about their performance as an employee? No, I know. Come on, that no should be stronger.
All right. So, as you saw, they really didn't want to hire any University of Michigan fans. Over 100 people in the room, and only 3 raised their hands that they would hire a University of Michigan fan. And I gave them a chance to change their minds. I said, hey, University of Michigan fan, that they're not, doesn't have anything to do with their performance as an employee. And they really weren't willing to move on that much. So as we can see, halo effect and horns effect, in this case, horns effect, is a very powerful cognitive bias, and makes even very experienced HR professionals who were there for a diversity inclusion conference have experience and be strongly moved by unconscious bias to the extent that they wouldn't hire these folks. So I want to ask you, in your organization, do you think it would be valuable for you and your team to investigate and address any negative impacts from the halo effect or the horns effect in your organization? Do you think that would be valuable for you? Please go ahead and vote. Yes or no? Do you think it would be valuable for you? I see we have 2/3 of the people voting. Let's give you 5 more seconds. Make your voice heard. All right, so we see that the overwhelming majority of you, over 95%, so over 20, lots and lots of you would really find this valuable to address either the halo effect or the horns effect or both. Glad to hear that. So that's something that you can bring to your organization and let them know, the organizational leadership, the team, and say, hey, here are some
concepts that I think would be very valuable for us to address. The halo effect and the horns effect, here's how they might be a problem, and here's how to address them. All right, let's talk about the next step. I want to talk about another series of cognitive biases that I think it will be valuable for you to address. And this is something that people often don't talk about and think about in terms of unconscious bias. We tend to think more about the obvious things, the visible things, appearance and things like values, religion, the protected categories, the legally protected categories from discrimination. But there are other aspects of unconscious bias, which in making good quality decisions can be just as important to address and make sure that you're not falling into these forms of unconscious bias. And that has to do with the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. So, and you've probably, these are much more intuitive than the halo effect and the horns effect. You've probably figured out what they are. The optimism bias, that has to do with being very optimistic about the world. I'm very optimistic about the world. That's probably the biggest cognitive bias for me. The biggest problem is the optimism bias. I tend to be very creative, very entrepreneurial, very open to new experiences. I tend to see the world as a place full of rewards. I think I feel the grass is green on the other side of the hill. I have 20 ideas before breakfast and it feels like they're all brilliant. So that's me. I'm opportunity-oriented, entrepreneurial, creative, but the problem for me, people who are optimistically biased like I am, is that they're too risk blind. And I definitely am too risk blind, and I don't see the risks that I really should be seeing. And that's a problem. The pessimism bias is the opposite. It's people who see more threats than opportunities. They tend to focus on not creating new ideas or being entrepreneurial, but on stabilizing things and managing things and improving them, including quality. So these are people who manage threats, stabilize and improve things, but they tend to be too risk averse. So that is another aspect. So this is all, of course, on a spectrum. There are people who are more extreme optimism bias, and they tend to be more on the extreme edge. There are people who are more moderate. There are people who have a moderate pessimism bias. There are people who have an extreme pessimism bias. So on average, when I've worked with quality professionals in consulting, coaching, training, I see that people in the ASQ professionals tend to be in the moderately pessimistic on average. And of course, some tend to be optimistic, some tend to be extremely pessimistic, but on average, I've seen folks be moderately pessimistic. Now, it's very important to have at least 2 people of each type on your team if you really want to have a successful and effective project. You need both on your team. Now, it's very tempting for me. So I run a small company called Disaster Avoidance Experts. I mentioned coaching, I mentioned consulting. So we do consulting, coaching, training, how to collaborate effectively, make good decisions, address unconscious bias, manage risks. That's what we do. It's very tempting for me to only hire people who are optimistic on my team. I click with them. I get along with them very well. It feels good for me to work with other optimists. But that's a problem. I think about if we had, so it's a 6-people company, if I had all the other 5 people were optimists, and we'd have 120 ideas before breakfast, and we'd all be reinforcing each other's ideas and we'd be saying, we're running in 120 different directions. That's not a good way to run a company. That's one of the reasons why lots of companies fail. You're pursuing too many different projects, not focused enough on what matters, and not really discriminating between good ideas and bad ideas. Instead, I make sure to hire pessimists, folks who, when I give them my 20 supposedly brilliant ideas, they would say, hey, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe these 3 are worth finishing baking. And then they look at these 3 ideas, they fix their problems, and they improve them, and then they implement them. The pessimists are great at improving things and implementing things that are less good at coming up with new ideas. And so I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Do you think it would be helpful for you and your team to investigate and address any negative impacts from the optimism bias or the pessimism bias? And I've seen in organizations especially with quality professionals being criticized for being Mrs. No or Mr. No for being too pessimistic. But of course, there's a very good reason for them to be pessimistic, whereas Production folk tend to be very optimistic, or R&D tends to be very optimistic. And that's a problem. Sales, very, very optimistic. That's a problem where people who are quality professionals are not given due credit for their good decision making in criticizing some negative ideas, some problematic ideas. Okay, I see that just under 2/3 of you voted, so I'll give you 5 more seconds. Make your voice heard. All right, so we see that not quite as popular as the halo effect and the horns effect, but definitely way over 90% would like to address negative impacts from the optimism bias or the pessimism bias in your organization. So this is good. So you'll want to bring these ideas to your organization, your leadership, and say, hey, I think these are some of the negative dynamics we might be having in our organization, and we should take steps to address them. And I'll talk in the second half of the presentation about how to identify and address these problems. The first half is about what the problems are. All right. So let's talk about how you can overcome these dangerous judgment errors. That's what we want to do. So we're reaching the second half of the presentation. How can you take steps to overcome these dangerous judgment errors when you're making decisions around people? Halo effect, horns effect, optimism bias, pessimism bias, overconfidence bias, and many, many other cognitive biases. There are over 100 of them altogether. Not all of them are relevant to professional settings. There are 30 that are most relevant, and I'll send you some resources on the 30 that are most relevant if you want them. But that's what you want to understand. Overcoming these dangerous judgment errors is the key. And to do so, you need to go against your intuitions. And it's very uncomfortable, I have to say, when you're learning how to do this. Not trusting your intuitions feels very hard, not trusting your gut. You have to remember that our intuitions were great for helping those early humans survive. That's what they evolved for. But in the modern, complex, multipolar, global world, that tribalism is a very bad idea that harms us in making good decisions. And we've learned to overcome our intuitions in a number of areas. So think about, let's say, sugar, right? Right now, there's a lot of processed sugar around, those donuts, right? Tim Hortons donuts, delicious donuts. Imagine that a grateful vendor sent you a box of donuts that's sitting in the break room, and pass by those dozen donuts. It's very tempting to take that chocolate glazed donut, maybe take half a donut. And once you take half a donut, you don't want to leave half a donut for somebody else. So you take the other half. And then you're kind of triggered by the sugar. So you take another donut and a third donut. And before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me, right? So this is a tendency that comes from our savannah background. In the savannah environment, it was very important for us to be triggered by sugar. So we have more and more sugar. That was very important for our survival as a species and for our survival as an individual, of course. So the individuals who were most strongly triggered by sugar were the ones who survived, thrived, and reproduced, and we're their descendants. In the modern environment, it's a very bad idea to be so strongly triggered by sugar. If we were building the perfect human being, we'd build a human being who loves salads and loves eating healthy food. But nobody's born by liking salads. Babies like candy. They have to be taught to like salads. So this is a problem. And you've probably figured out some ways of addressing this problem in your health by having better habits, maybe passing by those donuts sent by a grateful vendor and going for a bowl of fruit sent by another grateful vendor. So that's a much healthier and less triggering snack, less triggering dessert. That's a good strategy. And you've probably figured out others. So you figured out strategies to address your physical fitness, but you also need to figure out strategies to address your mental fitness. Make sure that you're making good decisions going forward. That's what addressing unconscious bias involves. Now, I'm going to ask you in another poll. Did you ever have the following happen to you? You made a bad decision. And looking back, you realized you had the information you needed to make a better decision. I certainly know that happened to me. I had an assistant manager. I had a person who I promoted to a role of assistant manager within disaster avoidance experts, my organization. And it turned out that, I thought she would do well, but she really didn't. She ended up micromanaging people, and she ended up not really separating herself from her previous role. So I was pretty wrong about her, even though I thought that she would do a great job. And so I had the information, I realized, looking back, to make the right decision, but I didn't. And I'm curious if you had that experience. See, about half of you voted. Give you 5 more seconds. Make sure that you make your voice heard. All right, so we see definitely that happened to the overwhelming majority of you. Over 90% of you had the experience happen. And if you had the experience happen, then you understand what it means to fall into an unconscious bias, to fall into one of these cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors that we make because of how our brain is wired, our evolutionary background. That's the feeling that where you actually have the information you need to make a good decision, but you don't. That's because of these cognitive biases. Let's talk about what you do to address these problems. Now, understand that what we're talking about, the skills that you want to build, are emotional intelligence and social intelligence. These are the broad areas of skills that you'll want to use to address unconscious bias within yourself and within other people. Emotional intelligence has to do about you. That's what it's about. Emotional intelligence, you might have heard this term, that's about your ability to be aware and to manage your own emotions. To what extent do you know what you feel? Do you know how well you could control your gut intuitions, those comforting emotions that tell you to do one thing where maybe that's not the right thing to do? So you have to be aware of them, and then you have to redirect yourself in the right direction. You have to be aware that you're kind of going for the donut, and you have to redirect yourself toward the bowl of fruit. And similarly about other people, you have to be aware that you're unconsciously too negative or too positive about other people and redirect yourself in another direction. That's about you. Now, social intelligence is about other people. So that has to do with your ability to be aware of and to manage other people's emotions and their relationships to you and to each other. Of course, unconscious bias has to do with decision making around people. So you want, as part of social intelligence, you want to be emotionally intelligent, that's about you. You also want to be socially intelligent. As a quality professional, that's a critical skill. Not simply about yourself, that's the emotional intelligence, but social intelligence, in order to ensure quality on whatever you're doing, to make sure the process is going on well, to make sure that people aren't cutting corners. You need to be able to influence them, to not help them not make bad decisions around people and around projects, of course. So awareness of other people's bad decision-making, unconscious biases, and so on, these cognitive biases that I've been talking about, and being able to influence them is critically important. And I'm curious, having learned about these skills, or maybe you knew about them before, but now that we talked about them, do you think that it would be valuable for you and your team to develop further your emotional intelligence and social intelligence compared to where it is right now? Do you think it would be valuable for you and your team to further develop your emotional intelligence and social intelligence? Please go ahead and vote. All right, so pretty quick voting on this one. I see we've got already 2/3 of them. So I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right, so definitely overwhelming, even better than some of the other polls. You see the vast majority of you see it as really important and valuable to further develop your emotional intelligence and your social intelligence. That's great. I'll send you some resources on doing this, and we'll talk about specific techniques for doing so as part of the next stages of this presentation. Great. Now, the first thing to do to address these problems is to really know about them, understand what's going on within yourself and within other people. So the way to do so is to have an assessment, assess what's going on. And this assessment, I mentioned the 30 most dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases in professional settings, it focuses on them, this assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace that my company developed. It evaluates their extent and their impact, both their extent, how present they are, and their impact, how impactful they are in your workplace in particular, and provides you with specific next steps for addressing each one of them. So let's take a look at what this assessment looks like. I'll share my screen again. Should all be able to see my screen. So take a look at the directions. The directions tell you for the assessment that each of these questions refers to a problem that occurs in everyday professional setting situations, whether you're talking about your work as quality or all sorts of other professional situations. And your goal is to indicate how often, how frequently the problem occurred in the last year. This doesn't ask about the specific cognitive bias. It doesn't ask about overconfidence bias, halo effect, Horn's effect. It talks about behaviors. So behaviors, everyone can observe it. Everyone can see, okay, what's going on. You'll want to answer the questions in percentage terms, that of how often it might have occurred in the last year. How often did it specifically occur? Focus on your own workplace, your own team, as you're talking about this. When you're doing the assessment more broadly, you can talk about the organization as a whole and so on. But for the sake of this exercise, focus on your own team. Don't overthink it. You should really go with your initial estimates. Again, each question should take 10, 15, 20 seconds. And let's start with question 6. When a potential or current employee was evaluated, in what percentage of the situations was the evaluation too positive due to factors not relevant to their job competency or organizational fit? So, how often was it too positive? You'll see a poll right now and answer how often was it too positive, anywhere on the scale. So how often was it too positive? So we see one person. So go ahead, please answer these questions. A little bit slower voting on this one. We have 1/3, so I'll give you 10 more seconds because a little bit slower voting. Couple more, make your voice heard. All right. So, as you can see, we have a wide spread, and of course that's natural, depends on the company. This could be a more problematic situation in one company, in one organization, less problematic in the other. But the plurality of answers seem to center around 70%, 80%. So 70%, yeah, that's pretty big, I have to say. So when you look at this question, when you're in the 10 to 20% range, it's not a big deal. Happens. When you're getting into the 20 to 30% range, that becomes more of a serious issue. When you're getting into the 40, 50% range, that becomes a really serious issue because you're just not evaluating people fairly and appropriately and accurately. And of course, when we see it in the 70% range for lots of folks where that's the plurality, that's a bit definitely a dangerous issue because the evaluation and performance system is just not functioning as it should. That's a big problem. Now, as you'll see, I'm not going to go into the other questions, but as you'll see, all of the other questions, there are 29 other questions which have to do, each of them has to do with a cognitive bias. So now obviously number 6 has to do with the halo effect. So I already talked about that. And of course, number 3 has to do with the overconfidence bias and a number of other questions here. They're all described in the later parts of the assessment. So you'll learn about them. Your team can take the assessment together, learn about them, and figure out how to address the problems as part of the assessment. Now, given that, I'm curious for the poll, so we have a similar poll. How valuable do you think it would be for you and your team to take this assessment and address the cognitive biases this uncovers? And Zhanska asked to share the assessment and the key to it. Yes, of course. I'll share the assessment. I'll give everyone an opportunity to get the resources from the presentation, and those who want the resources will get the resources. So no worries about that. Okay, we have about 50% of the people voting, so I'll give you 5 more seconds. You're welcome, John. Zanhana, sorry, mispronounced your name, Zanhana. All right. So yeah, so we see that overwhelmingly over 90% of you would find it valuable. That's great to hear. So those of you who will find it valuable, you'll have an opportunity to receive it. Just again, for a similar poll, you'll vote, you'll indicate that you'll want to receive it, and I'll send it to you after the presentation. And pretty quickly after the presentation, after the organizers get me your information, your emails, so I can send those. And once you get it, you'll want to take it yourself, of course. So take a little bit of time, take it yourself. It should take about 10 to 15 minutes to take the assessment, maybe another 5 minutes to self-score it. And then you'll want to bring it to your team. Bring it to your team and suggest to them that, hey, this seems like a quite useful assessment, and I think we should take it and we should discuss it and we should address the cognitive biases it uncovers. Now, what happens once you uncover these cognitive biases? What steps can you take to address them? A very good technique to take steps to address them is to have a standardized decision-making process you use around people. When you're making people decisions, you can use this for all sorts of decisions, not simply people decisions, but people decisions is what's really relevant to addressing unconscious bias. So 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. Again, you can apply this to all sorts of decisions. Here are the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. It's a very quick, very effective technique. Takes only a couple of minutes once you learn to apply it, and it will help you make good enough decisions. This is not about the perfect decision. This is not about, hiring the next crew, the next quality management leader for your company. This is not what it's about. For that, you need quite a bit longer and more involved process. But it's for those daily decisions that you make around people that you need to make all the time. Let's say you're sending an email that you don't want to screw up to a colleague. You're trying to influence your colleague who is in the production department to maybe not take such shortcuts next time, or to comply with filling out quality forms in a timely manner, to make sure to go through all the steps that they need to. Or perhaps you're trying to decide who should be part of a project team and who shouldn't, who should be part of a meeting and who shouldn't. These are all sorts of people decisions that you want to make sure that you make good decisions, but they're good enough decisions. You don't need to make the perfect decision. So here are the 5 questions that you should ask around any decision that you don't want to screw up, that you just want to make good enough decision. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? Fully consider, so there are 2 parts of this question that you want to pay attention to. Fully consider. We tend to not fully consider information that goes against our intuitions. So let's say you're trying to get somebody to do something that they don't really want to do. Let's say you're trying to get somebody in the operations department to actually go for the quality process and not cut corners like they would like, or to fill out the quality form in a timely manner so that things aren't held up. What important information haven't you fully considered? Maybe it's tempting to not consider the information about how much time it might take them to do this. So that's something you might not have considered, and they feel busy and they feel overwhelmed and they feel rushed. So you might not have fully considered that information that goes against your intuitions. And the second part of it is what information is important. Their time is important. Their incentives are important. What are they incentivized to do? Their supervision structure is important. The ways that you can influence them are important. So think about what's important information and what's not important. So you don't need to waste your time with considering information that's not so important. What dangerous judgment errors haven't you yet fully addressed here? So think about what might be going on. Might you have the overconfidence bias? Might you be feeling too good about your ability to influence them? Maybe you haven't considered the optimism bias. Is this person from operations, do they tend to be optimistic? And then they maybe feel that they don't really need quality going through their production, and it's just a slow down and a drag and anchor on their activities. And you'll want to address that in your email to this person. Then what would an objective and trusted advisor suggest you do? So maybe somebody who's in the ASQ Vancouver colleague or in the board of it, maybe a mentor in your organization, a peer, someone you look up to, a coach or consultant, somebody like that who you trust. What would that angel on your shoulder tell you to do? You get about 50% of the benefit of this question just by asking it, just by taking yourself outside of yourself, asking, what would you tell a trusted and objective friend to do? What would you tell a trusted friend to do in the situation as an objective external observer? And you get the other 50% of the benefit. This is an important enough question by asking the person. Maybe have somebody who you trust read the email in advance before you send it. Next, how have you addressed all the ways this could fail? So think about all the ways that your decision can go wrong. How have you addressed it? If you're thinking about who to include in a project meeting, maybe if you don't include the right people, then the people will feel not heard, the stakeholders will feel not engaged, not included, and then the project will start off on the wrong foot. Or maybe if you have too many of the wrong people, maybe they will try to direct the project in their direction. For the email, maybe you haven't considered that this person might be receiving the email in, let's say you're working in after hours and you're sending the email after hours, and this person might not be happy about getting an email after hours and feel like pressured to respond. So maybe you want to use a scheduler, automatic scheduler, to send it in the morning, let's say, instead of after hours, and help that person have a better experience. Finally, what new information would cause you to revisit this decision? We tend to be stuck on decisions. Once we make a decision, we tend to be committed to it. And that's not a good idea. But it's called post factum rationalization. We rationalize our decision after the fact. You don't want to fall into that trap. Try to decide in advance what would cause you to change your mind about the decision. So let's say you send the email and you don't hear anything from that person for a day, 2 days, 3 days. You would tend to feel anxious, upset, worried. Why is this person not responding? They're supposed to. But if you set a timeline for yourself, let's say if you don't hear from that person by the end of the work week, well, let's say if you don't hear from that person within 5 days, 5 working days, then you will give that person a call. That's a very clear timeline. That's what's going on, what's appropriate. And then you're not feeling anxious, you're not feeling worried. Just know what's going to happen in that 5 working days. So that's an easy way to address this sort of people decisions and make sure that you don't fall into unconscious bias. And it's a very helpful technique to use with a team. So when you as a team are making a decision, whether it's a people decision or just a general decision, you can use this 5-question technique, have everyone answer the question before they come to the meeting for themselves, and then structure the meeting agenda around the 5 questions. And then during the meeting agenda, you'll just go through the 5 questions, and you can feel everyone shares their answer, you discuss it, you come to a consensus, and you go on. And then you can feel very confident that you've addressed all the important aspects of a decision to make sure that you make a good enough decision at the end of it. Now, given this technique, I'm curious whether you think it would be valuable for you and your team to use the 5 questions technique to avoid making bad decisions in cases where good enough is good enough. So please go ahead and vote. Do you think this would be valuable for you and your team? So we have just over 50% of the people voting. I'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, this definitely seems like one of the most popular ones. So we have over 95% of the people, 97% of the people feel that this would be really valuable for them and their team. That's great. So I'll send you resources on this if you want them, and you'll get a decision aid, and you'll use this decision aid for yourself, print it out, put it by the computer. I have folks doing that all the time, just using that by their computer. I have one by my computer. So over here, you should be able to see it. The decision-making techniques printed out, and then send it to your team and encourage them to use it as well. And consider using it for team decision-making for team decision-making, that's very helpful. All right. So I mentioned those free resources, and I'll be happy to share them with you. So here are the free resources that you can get after the presentation. These are the key post-training resources that are based on the information presented. First is the assessment that I mentioned on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace that one of you, Zahana, was saying is very useful. So I'm glad to hear that. So please, you'll be able to vote on that. And that's one of the resources. The other resource is decision aid on these 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters that you can use by yourself and with your team. I encourage you to send it to your team as well. And of course, the assessment as well, use them both with your team as well as by yourself. Next is a digital copy of my best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, focusing specifically on how you can make the best decisions about other people and how you can influence other people to make the best decisions around other people. So addressing unconscious bias within yourself and within other people. And finally, free coaching sessions. I have free open slots, first come, first serve basis. After the organizers of the meeting, ASQ Vancouver, gets me the names and emails of the people who want the resources, I'll send you an email with all of them, and you'll have a link there that you can click on. The first 3 people who click the link and schedule the meeting, you'll get the meeting. If you click on the link and you can't schedule it, that means the free slots are taken. So I think that's fair. All right, we'll do the same thing, polling, as you saw before. So free resources. Would you like to get the key post-training free resources from me as the trainer? And again, the ASQ Vancouver will get me the information. I'll send that to you afterwards. So I'll send that to you afterwards. Please go ahead and vote. I see half the people, just over half the people voted. So please go ahead and vote. I'll be happy to take questions while folks are voting. So yeah, we can separate those. So yeah, so let's go on to the questions, and you can put them into the chat. That'll be the easiest way. And the ASQ Vancouver hosts will read the questions and go ahead. So please go ahead. Put them in, read them out.
So we have a question here, which was posed in the beginning of the conversation. And the question is saying that based on our experience, discount newer professional peers' knowledge. I honestly don't know to which part of the conversation this question was addressed. Maybe the person who asked, Joanne Purcell, can ask this question again.
So do we, based on our experience, discount? So I think that's probably was asked about the question, how the confidence.
Yes.
Yeah. Quality professionals do tend to excessively discount newer professionals' knowledge. They don't tend to account for the fact that those newer professionals, they have newer information that they're learning about in their certification courses. And they also tend to discount the newer technology savvy skills of quality professionals, younger quality professionals. So I've seen both of those be problems as things that are excessively discounted. So yes, that's something for you to keep in mind and address and not discount.
Okay. What studies have been performed to validate that these specific tools work?
I'll be happy. That's best shared in the resources that I'll send to you. So there have been extensive studies showing that this is a field called debiasing. This is actually my field of expertise. So debiasing is, so you have the earlier studies were about these cognitive biases. What are they? How do they screw us up? How do they cause us to make bad decisions? My area of expertise, I'm kind of a second generation scholar and practitioner focusing on debiasing. How do we address these cognitive biases? So for example, the assessment. What we've seen from research on cognitive biases is that just knowing about cognitive biases helps somewhat, but doesn't help you that much to address them. What really helps you address them is understanding their extent and impact in your workplace, in your work, and seeing how much it impacts you and harms you. So that's the assessment, and that's what the kind of studies are that validate it, and they're cited in the assessment. Then for the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters, each one of them is based on specific techniques that are meant from debiasing that address a number of cognitive biases. For example, question-free on getting the trusted and objective advice is based on what's called the external perspective research. We have extensive evidence that taking an external perspective ourselves, and especially getting somebody else's input, is really helpful for us to address these cognitive biases. How do we address all the ways this can fail? There are a number of techniques that are called consider the alternative. Consider the alternative scenarios, consider how things can go wrong, something called the pre-mortem, that help us address these sorts of problems. And each of the questions is based on that. So thank you for the question.
Sorry, how do we encourage our older peers to accept our younger colleagues' knowledge?
So what I encourage folks to do is look and predict what kind of questions and techniques do the younger people get right, and what kind of questions and techniques do the older people get right. And so the folks who are more experienced will tend to be more overconfident. And when you look at their answers on questions and how they approach problems, when you predict who will approach a problem in a better way, you'll often see that younger people approach a problem in a better way, solve it quicker, collaborate with others in a more effective manner. So predicting and seeing, showing that, hey, younger people can often do better than older people, more experienced ones, will help pave the way to doing that. And especially with confidence, where older folks tend to have much more confidence than they should.
Okay, thank you. You need to make a decision in minutes and you don't have time to go through this decision aid. How do you manage the situation?
Actually, the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters is meant to take about 2 minutes. So let's go back to that so I can show you. What important information didn't I yet fully consider? Once you have some practice with that, that goes very quickly. So fully considering, you'll immediately see, okay, I'm not considering the fact that this person I am interacting with, like operations, that there's this negative, that this person might be feeling that what I'm proposing is wasting time. So I'll need to address their time concerns in my email. Dangerous judgment errors, Horn's effect, or something like that. Trust and objective advisors suggest they do. So think about that ideal person. They tell you that here is some experienced ways that I've addressed this problem. Addressing the ways this could fail, again, sending it in the right manner, maybe revising the email to make sure that it has the best impact. And what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? So again, setting a timeline. That's a very quick process. People who have learned and practiced this, it takes about 2 to 3 minutes if the decision is the right one. And of course, you want to take more minutes, more time if the decision is the wrong one. Now, I have to tell you, techniques like this have been adapted to the use of firefighters in the UK. So there's been studies done on firefighters in the UK, leaders, who, when you look at the prior to using questions, they had a similar free question tool applied to their techniques. And you saw prior to their use of this free question tool that about 80% of firefighting errors come from human error. So firefighting leaders making bad decisions. Now, after being trained on a tool like this, you'll see that firefighting leaders who have been trained on it make decisions in about the same time as firefighting leaders who haven't been trained on this similar tool. But they make many fewer mistakes. So it's a really great way of standardizing your decision-making process and addressing cognitive biases. It really doesn't take much more time than an ordinary decision.
Thank you. How do you encourage and assess these biases while hiring employees in quality department?
So you want to identify what kind of employees your department is lacking. I mentioned about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. That's often a problem, where you have too many people who are thinking alike in a number of ways. So you want to make sure to give more favor, to give more credit to people who have different mental patterns, to have diversity of mental patterns in the department. So again, you want to identify what's going on within the department, what kind of issues do you want to address by hiring people who are different than you. And when you're doing the hiring, you want to give more credit than you intuitively feel to people who are different than you on a number of categories. So, and for people who are similar to you, you want to subtract credit, because intuitively, from the example I was giving before, people who are in Columbus, Ohio will give more intuitive credit to people who are Buckeyes fans than they deserve. And what they should do, and what I've worked with a number of companies in doing, is decreasing the points that they're rated if they're Buckeyes fans, because you'll intuitively rate them too highly. And again, increasing their points if they are from different areas, if you feel they are different from you. So that's what you want to be doing.
Thank you. Are gut instincts ever valuable?
Oh yeah, gut instincts can be valuable in areas where you have extensive experience. What happens with our intuition? So you've probably think when we're thinking about intuition, intuition is useful in areas where you have extensive experience and quick feedback showing that, hey, your decision is right. So you've probably heard about expert intuition. Let's say you've been looking at, let's say, at profit and loss statements. So if you're in a position to make decisions on profit and loss statements, you've seen P&L statements a lot and you can tell at a glance what's going on. In your, let's say, quality work, when you have certain forms, you probably know that, hey, these are the ways that these forms will tend to be filled out incorrectly. Or when you're working with operations folks, you probably know from your experience that, hey, these are the corners that they'll tend to cut just because that's the experience that you'll have. And you'll be looking for that. And you can trust yourself that you've had quick feedback, extensive experience. You've probably heard of 10,000 hours of practice. You don't need 10,000 hours of practice, but extensive experience with something and quick feedback. Those are the specific domains where you can trust yourself to be making reasonably accurate decisions. I mean, for an everyday example, when you're looking at your email, you can probably tell at a glance what's spam and what's not, what are good emails, valuable, and triage them pretty quickly. So that's another example where we have extensive experience. We can do that. But we should not generalize from that experience to other domains. Just because you can take a look at the profit and loss statement, or you can take a look at the email, or you can take a look at your quality process and know the kind of corners that people will tend to cut, doesn't mean you can make good hiring decisions, and doesn't mean you can trust yourself when you're evaluating other people.
Thank you. When one has to make a decision with limited time, is it ever possible to take into account all the inputs?
Oh, absolutely not. That's why the question, when I look at the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters, the first question is, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So here, the key thing is important information. I mentioned, several things that you decide are important. Other things that you decide are not important. And those things that are not important, you want to make sure to not to focus on them. And of course, the more important, the more critical the question, if you're making, let's say, a hiring decision, you'll want to consider more factors. So the more important decision, the more impactful, the more information you'll want to consider. The less important decision, the less factors you'll want to consider. So you want to give appropriate amount of time and energy and effort to the decision depending on its importance.
Thank you. We have a repeating question from Paul. How do we encourage our younger peers to accept our older colleagues' knowledge? I think you already answered this question.
I think I answered the reverse question. How do you encourage the older people to accept the younger peers' knowledge? I think, again, having the same process is really helpful. Having younger people predict when they will get the question right, having older people predict when they will get the question right, and showing younger peers that, hey, the older peers will often have specific know-how, experience that younger peers have not picked up in their schools and their learning and their familiarity with technology. There's definitely lots of valuable stuff that older professionals have with their know-how, their decades of experience that younger peers don't. So you want to be able to balance those.
Thank you. Is every cognitive bias bad?
By definition. So cognitive biases, by definition, are problematic because they deviate away from the optimal decision-making process. So cognitive biases are, by definition, deviating away from the good decision. You want, for example, with the optimism bias and the pessimism bias, ideally, you would be perfectly balanced. You'd be balanced right between the extreme of optimism and extreme of pessimism. But that's not what reality takes place. Now, you might gain benefits from having someone on your team like me who's very optimistic and someone who is more pessimistic. So in some cases, from a team perspective, it might be good to have some optimists and some pessimists. But for an optimist or a pessimist, that's always bad. As an individual, the cognitive bias is always bad because I tend to take too many risks that I shouldn't. And the pessimist takes not enough risk. So sometimes from a team perspective, it's going to be beneficial. But from an individual perspective, cognitive biases are always bad.
Yeah, I also have a question. I can probably ask my question now here because you're talking about optimism and pessimism biases. You also mentioned that it's good to have at least one or better two people with these characteristics in the team. And my question is about the conflict. Will it introduce a conflict and how to avoid a situation when one dominates another, how to avoid that dominance?
What you want to do is, I mentioned before how I work with people who are pessimists. And that's the ideal way the teams work. You often hear about brainstorming. Brainstorming, the traditional brainstorming, has actually not been shown to be very effective at all. When you have all the people on the team together trying to brainstorm ideas, that's a miserable experience. It tends to be for pessimists and not great for optimists, because what happens is that optimists would tend to generate a lot of ideas. Pessimists would spend their time trying to restrain themselves from criticizing the ideas, and that's not good for anyone. The ideal way of doing things is for optimists and pessimists to generate ideas before the meeting, and you'll find that optimists tend to generate way more ideas. Then they share ideas at the meeting, and then the pessimists are the ones who should be doing the evaluation. The optimists hand off the ideas. They're not good at evaluating and criticizing ideas. The pessimists on the team should be the ones who take ownership of the ideas, evaluate them, choose the best ones, and then implement them effectively. So that way you minimize conflicts and you have the best balance of use of the talents of each one in the appropriate place in generating and evaluating and implementing ideas.
Okay, thank you. It's actually a request. Please share your experience which surprised you on dealing with biases.
Oh gosh, so when I was learning about them, of course, I was surprised a lot. I mentioned about the accent discrimination. Probably, the most impactful surprise was the optimism bias, because I had no idea about the optimism bias before I learned about optimism bias as a cognitive bias in my PhD program. That helped me realize all the ways that I was making bad decisions around other people. Now, another one that was really important for me was called the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect has to do with how we perceive other people who we are close to. Now, when you think about other people you're close to, the false consensus effect is a cognitive bias that describes how we tend to greatly overestimate the way to which people who we like and who are like us tend to agree with us, tend to share our perspectives, our values. That helped me have, in my personal life, a much better relationship to my wife, because I wasn't overestimating the extent to which she was agreeing with me. And that helped me have much better professional relationships with my colleagues when I was doing consulting, coaching, training. Now I tend to not overestimate the kind of agreements that I feel that people should have with me. And I tend to be much more curious and inquisitive and make less assumptions. So those are two examples that have been really helpful for me.
Thank you. Is it possible to be perfectly balanced?
I presume this is about optimism bias and pessimism bias. And yes, of course, there are some people who are going to be perfectly balanced in that middle. And that just depends. A lot of these cognitive biases are greatly informed by our genetics. So to be clear, the optimism bias and the pessimism bias tends to be very much genetically oriented. You can see from babies, where some babies are going to be very curious, very inquisitive, going around, crawling, exploring the world. Other babies will be sitting in the corner and playing with blocks. And it's neither is a particularly bad thing, it's just the reality of our genes determining our personalities. And so some babies will be right in the middle, and some adults will be right in the middle. And of course, we are impacted also by how we're brought up. If somebody's brought up in a very negative, hostile conditions, they'll tend to be more pessimistic. If somebody's brought up in a wonderful condition, they'll be more optimistic than their baseline. So yes, it's possible to be perfectly balanced.
Thank you. How can we leverage these concepts while doing performance appraisals, negotiating deals, sales for organization, etc.?
So what you want to do is figure out the process by which you're doing the performance appraisal, negotiation, sales. You want to clearly see what kind of process you have, what are the steps that you take, and then identify the kind of cognitive biases that might be present in each step. So might you be falling into the overconfidence bias when you're negotiating sales? I can definitely tell you that yes is the answer to that, when especially closer to the end of a quarter. So when I work with sales teams, what I tend to overwhelmingly see as the quarter approaches ending, the sales professionals tend to overestimate the likelihood of which they will make a sale. And they'll say, oh yeah, definitely, I'll meet my target, we'll make sales, 80% of these deals will convert. And then you'll see that actually, 50 or 40 convert. And the closer again it is to the end of the quarter, the more they tend to overestimate the conversion of these deals. So you'll want to identify the processes that you have in each of these areas. And then by identifying the processes, you will then be able to figure out, hey, what's actually going on and where can we address and what kind of cognitive biases do we need to address here?
And I think the last one is the comment, overall feedback rather than a question. So it seems that we don't have any more questions in the chat.
Great. So I think this is probably the time for the last poll. And the poll will be on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest score. How would you rate your overall experience? So great, launching that poll. Please go ahead and vote. In the meantime, what was the comment? Oh, so Dwayne shares their responses that it's important to realize they don't have all the answers and they have a lot to learn from their team and discuss all views. Yes, those are definitely important insights, and the resources that I'll send afterward will help you learn more about these steps. See, 73% of the people voted. See if anybody will more. I'll give you 5 more seconds for anyone who else. Oh, Christopher Van Loo asks, where do you put your information for the resources? So if you already voted on question 9, then you'll get your information. If you didn't vote on it, you can just put your email in the chat and I will send it to you afterwards. So because I'll have your email. So just put your email in the chat if you didn't have a chance to vote for question 5. For question 9 for the free resources. All right, so I think it's probably everyone will vote who will vote. So ending the polling. All right. Great, so I think that's the end of the presentation unless anybody has any more questions. And I appreciate you attending. And the ASQ organizers will send me the information after the event. And as soon as they send me the information, I will send you the resources to those who voted for getting the resources.
So no more questions, what?
No more questions. I don't see more questions.
Okay,
Well,
yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Gleb, for the outstanding presentation today, and we appreciate your continued support. So if there is no any questions, so we can leave. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're
So
very
I
welcome.
will touch base with you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the good words in the chat. All right. Y'all have
Bye.
a good day. Bye-bye.